The November rain hammered against the windows of Rosewood Tavern like an angry ghost demanding entry. It was one of those cold, merciless nights in Chicago's South Side, where the wind cut through your coat and the darkness seemed to swallow the streetlights whole. Inside the bar, however, warmth radiated from the amber glow of overhead lamps, the smell of whiskey and grilled meat filling the air, and the low hum of conversation creating a cocoon against the brutality outside. Emma Caldwell stood behind the hostess stand, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed down her black apron for the 100th time that evening. It was only her third night on the job, and the nervousness hadn't worn off yet. At 26, she'd worked plenty of service jobs before, but Rosewood Tavern had a reputation. It wasn't just any neighborhood bar. It was the kind of place where deals were made in hushed tones in the back booths, where certain men commanded respect with just a glance, and where asking the wrong questions could get you fired, or worse. "Table for 4 right this way," Emma said softly to a group of middle-aged businessmen who barely acknowledged her presence. She led them to a corner booth, her practical black flats squeaking slightly on the polished hardwood floor. The tavern was packed tonight. A Thursday, which meant the regulars were out in full force and the kitchen was slammed. Emma could hear the head chef, Marcus, barking orders through the service window, his voice competing with the clatter of plates and the sizzle of meat on the grill. As she returned to her post, Emma's manager, a stocky man named Gerald with thinning hair and permanently tired eyes, grabbed her shoulder. "You're doing fine, kid. Just keep smiling and don't let them rattle you. Some of these guys, they like to test the new ones." Emma nodded, though her stomach tightened. She'd already noticed the way certain customers looked at her. Lingering stares, comments just loud enough for her to hear. She'd learned long ago to keep her head down, and her responses polite but brief. What Gerald didn't know, what nobody at Rosewood Tavern knew, was that Emma Caldwell wasn't just a struggling young woman trying to make rent. She was Emma Graves now, though she still used her maiden name at work. Her husband had insisted on it. "Keep your distance from my world," he'd told her on their wedding day, his dark eyes serious. "The less people know, the safer you are." Her husband, Vincent Graves. The name alone could silence a room in certain circles. Emma had met him 2 years ago under circumstances she still couldn't quite believe. She'd been waitressing at an upscale restaurant downtown when he walked in, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, moving with the kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without being asked. Their eyes had met across the dining room and something had shifted in the air. 3 months later, they were married in a small, private ceremony with no guests, except his lawyer and her younger sister. Vincent had been clear from the beginning about who he was. "I'm not a good man, Emma," he'd said, holding her hand across a candlelit table. "I've done things I can never take back, but I'll never lie to you and I'll protect you with my life." She'd believed him then, and she believed him now, even though she didn't fully understand the extent of his business. She knew he controlled territories, that he had men who answered to him, that police captains and judges owed him favors. She knew that when he came home late at night, sometimes there was blood on his knuckles that he'd wash away without explanation, but he'd kept his word. He'd been good to her, tender in ways that surprised her, protective without being controlling. He'd encouraged her to work, to maintain her independence. "I don't want you trapped," he'd said. "You're not my possession. You're my partner." So here she was, working at Rosewood Tavern under her maiden name, just another face in the crowd, and that was exactly how Vincent wanted it. The door swung open with a blast of cold air, and Emma looked up to see a group of 5 men stumbling in, already clearly drunk despite it being only 9:30. They were loud, obnoxious, wearing expensive jackets that didn't quite hide their beer bellies and flushed faces, the type of customers who thought money gave them the right to treat service workers like dirt. "Evening, gentlemen," Emma said with her practiced smile, grabbing 5 menus. "Table for 5? The one in front, a man with slicked-back gray hair and a gold watch that caught the light, looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. "Yeah, sweetheart, and make it quick. We're thirsty." Emma led them to a large table near the bar, hyper-aware of their eyes on her back, their snickering comments barely whispered. She distributed the menus with steady hands and gestured toward the bar. "Your server will be right with you. Can I get you started with anything to drink?" "6 pitchers of whatever's on tap," Goldwatch said, not even looking at her. "And tell them to hurry it up." Emma nodded and retreated, feeling their eyes boring into her as she walked away. She relayed the order to Danny, the bartender, a good guy in his 40s who'd been at Rosewood for 15 years and had seen everything. "That crew?" Danny said, already pulling the tap. They come in every few weeks. Bunch of real estate developers from the north side. Think they own the world. Just stay out of their way if you can. Emma returned to her stand, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. The night wore on. More customers arrived, were seated, ate, and left. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows like 1,000 urgent fingers. Emma's feet ached, and her smile felt more strained with each passing hour. It was nearly 11 when it happened. Emma was clearing a recently vacated table near the developer's booth when she heard one of them call out, "Hey, hostess girl." "Yeah, you." She turned, plates balanced in her hands. "Yes, sir? We need another round. Where the hell is our server?" "I'll find her right away, sir." As Emma turned to leave, she felt something cold and wet slam into her back. The shock of it made her gasp and stumble forward, the plates crashing to the floor in an explosion of ceramic shards. Beer soaked through her white shirt and black apron, dripping down her legs and pooling on the floor around her feet. The smell of cheap lager filled her nose as shocked silence descended on the tavern. Then the laughter started. Loud, cruel, unrestrained laughter from the table of developers. "Oh man, did you see her face?" one of them howled. "She just froze like a damn statue," another added, slapping the table. Goldwatch raised his empty pitcher triumphantly. "That's what you get for slow service, sweetheart." Emma stood there trembling, her face burning with humiliation. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. She could feel tears threatening to spill, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these men. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she tried to control her breathing. Gerald came rushing over, his face red. "Gentlemen, please, relax, man, it was just a joke," Goldwatch said, waving him off dismissively. "Your girl needs to learn to take a joke." Danny appeared with a mop and towel, his jaw tight with anger. He handed Emma the towel, his eyes sympathetic. "You okay?" Emma nodded mutely, taking the towel and dabbing uselessly at her soaked uniform. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to tell these men exactly what she thought of them. But she needed this job. She couldn't make a scene. "I'm sorry, Emma," Gerald said quietly. "Go to the back and clean up. Take your time." As Emma walked toward the kitchen, head held high despite the beer dripping from her hair, she heard one of the developers call after her, "Hey, don't be so sensitive, we're just having fun." The kitchen door swung shut behind her, muffling the sounds of the dining room. Emma stood there for a moment, finally allowing the tears to come, silent and hot on her cheeks. Marcus looked up from the grill, took one look at her, and his expression darkened. "What the hell happened?" "Just some customers. It's fine." "It's not fine," Marcus growled, but Emma waved him off, heading to the small bathroom in the back. She looked at herself in the mirror, hair plastered to her head, mascara running, uniform ruined. She looked like exactly what those men had tried to make her feel like. Worthless. But as she cleaned herself up, something cold and hard settled in her chest. She thought about Vincent, about what he would say if he knew. He'd told her to call him if she ever had trouble at work, but she'd always refused. She didn't want to be that woman, the one who ran to her husband to fight her battles. But standing there in that dingy bathroom, smelling like beer and shame, Emma made a decision. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She would call Vincent, not because she couldn't handle this herself, but because those men had crossed a line. They thought there were no consequences for treating people like garbage. They thought their money and their status made them untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Emma stared at her phone for a long moment, her thumb hovering over Vincent's contact. The bathroom's flickering fluorescent light cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look older, more tired than her 26 years. She could still hear the muffled sounds of the tavern beyond the door, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, and somewhere in that noise, the laughter of those men who had humiliated her. She pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, Vincent's deep voice came through, tinged with immediate concern. "Emma? What's wrong?" He always knew. She could never hide anything from him, not even over the phone. "I'm okay," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. Something happened at work." "Where are you right now?" His tone had shifted, still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "In the bathroom at the tavern." "Vincent, I don't want you to tell me what happened." It wasn't a request. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. There were these men, customers. They were drunken. They threw a pitcher of beer at me, all over me, in front of everyone. Her voice cracked on the last word and she hated herself for it. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, but Emma could feel the weight of it, the way the air itself seemed to compress with the force of Vincent's contained rage. "Are you hurt?" he asked finally, each word measured and precise. "No, just embarrassed, humiliated. Gerald sent me to clean up. These men, describe them." "Vincent, please don't." "Emma." His voice was soft now, almost gentle but no less commanding. "Describe them." She swallowed hard. 5 of them. Middle-aged, expensive clothes. Danny said they're real estate developers from the north side. They come in every few weeks. The one who threw the beer had gray hair slicked back. Gold watch. He seemed to be the leader. "What table?" "Near the bar. But Vincent, I don't want you to come here. I don't want to cause trouble. I just needed to hear your voice." "I know, baby. I know." His tone softened slightly. "Are you safe there? Is Gerald treating you right?" "Yes, he was. He was nice about it, told me to take my time." "Good. Listen to me carefully. I want you to clean yourself up, go back out there and finish your shift with your head held high. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, then realized he couldn't see her. "Yes. Those men don't get to take anything from you. Not your dignity, not your composure. You're stronger than they could ever comprehend. You understand?" "I understand. I'll handle this. But not tonight. Not there. You won't see anything, and you won't be involved. This is my promise to you. They will learn that there are consequences in this world, but you will be far away from it when they do." Emma felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. She knew what Vincent was capable of, even if she'd never witnessed it firsthand. She'd seen the respect, no, the fear, in people's eyes when his name was mentioned. She'd heard the whispered stories, the rumors that seemed too dark to be true, but probably weren't. "Vincent, don't do anything you'll regret." She heard something that might have been a soft laugh. "I never regret protecting what's mine. Finish your shift. I'll be waiting for you at home. And Emma, I love you. Don't ever hesitate to call me when someone disrespects you." "I love you too." The line went dead. Emma stood there for another moment, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were red, but the tears had stopped. She straightened her shoulders, fixed her ponytail as best she could, and walked back into the kitchen. Her uniform was still damp, but there was nothing to be done about it. She'd have to finish the shift like this. Marcus looked up as she emerged. "You all right, kid?" "I'm fine, thanks, Marcus. Those assholes are still out there laughing it up. Gerald should throw them out, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "They spend a lot of money here. It's okay. I can handle it." Emma pushed through the kitchen door and returned to the dining room. The moment she appeared, she felt eyes on her again, but this time she kept her head high, her expression neutral. She walked past the developer's table without so much as a glance in their direction, returning to her hostess stand as if nothing had happened. "Well, look who's back," Goldwatch called out. "Hope you're not too upset, sweetheart." "Like I said, just having a little fun." His companions erupted in fresh laughter. Emma didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge them. She simply stood at her post, greeting new arrivals with professional courtesy, seating them efficiently. Her hands had stopped shaking. Danny caught her eye from behind the bar and gave her a subtle nod of approval. Gerald hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable but not knowing what to do. The developers stayed for another hour, getting progressively louder and more obnoxious. They made crude jokes about Emma every time she passed by, but she moved through the room like a ghost, present but untouchable. She'd become something else in that bathroom, something harder, colder. Vincent's words had armored her. "You're stronger than they could ever comprehend." Finally, around midnight, the group settled their bill, leaving a deliberately insulting $5 tip on a $300 tab, and stumbled out into the rainy night, still laughing, still thinking they'd won something. Emma watched them go through the window. They climbed into 2 expensive SUVs parked illegally in the loading zone, doors slamming, engines roaring to life. Goldwatch flipped her off through the window before they pulled away. "I'm sorry about tonight," Gerald said, appearing at her elbow. "Those guys, they're regulars, big spenders, but what they did was way out of line." "It's fine, Gerald, really. Still, you handled it with class. Not everyone would have. Take tomorrow off if you need to. I'll be here." Gerald studied her face for a moment, seeming to sense something had shifted but unable to identify what. "All right then. Good night, Emma." The rest of the shift passed without incident. The tavern began to empty as closing time approached. Emma helped the servers clean up, wiping down tables, restocking menus, trying to keep busy so she wouldn't think too much about what Vincent might be planning. By 1:30 in the morning, Rosewood Tavern was locked up tight. Emma walked to her car, a modest Honda Civic that Vincent had bought her, insisting she needed reliable transportation, and drove through the empty, rain-slicked streets toward their home in Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park was a world away from the south side where she worked. Here the streets were clean and tree-lined, the brownstones elegant and expensive. Vincent's home, their home now, was a 3-story brick building with original hardwood floors and crown molding, the kind of place Emma never imagined she'd live in. She let herself in quietly, expecting Vincent to be in his study or perhaps already asleep. Instead, she found him in the living room sitting in his leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He was still dressed in his work clothes, black slacks, white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms marked with faint scars she'd never asked about. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes, dark brown, almost black in the dim lighting, traveled over her, taking in every detail. The stained uniform, the tired slump of her shoulders, the way she tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. Vincent set down his glass and stood in one fluid motion. In 3 strides he was across the room, pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that always surprised her given his size and strength. Emma collapsed against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent, expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "I'm okay," she mumbled into his shirt. "I know you are." His hand stroked her hair slowly, methodically. "But you shouldn't have to be. Not because of men like that." They stood there for a long moment, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking steadily, marking time in the darkness. "What are you going to do?" Emma finally asked. Vincent pulled back slightly, tilting her chin up so she was looking directly into his eyes. "What I always do. I'm going to make sure they understand the world doesn't work the way they think it does. That there are people in this city who can't be disrespected without consequence. Will you hurt them? Would it bother you if I did?" Emma thought about it honestly. A week ago, maybe even yesterday, she would have said yes immediately. But standing there in her beer-soaked uniform, remembering the humiliation, the laughter, the casual cruelty of men who thought themselves untouchable, she found she didn't have the answer Vincent probably expected. "I don't know," she said quietly. Vincent's expression softened. "That's an honest answer, and I respect it. But Emma, you need to understand something. Men like that, they go through life stepping on people because no one ever makes them pay for it. They hurt people for sport because in their world, there are no real consequences. Someone has to teach them differently, and that someone is you. Tonight it is, because they hurt my wife." The way he said it, "my wife," sent a shiver through her that wasn't entirely from fear. There was something primal and protective in those words, something that made her feel safer than she'd ever felt in her life, even as she recognized the danger in it. "When?" she asked. "Soon. Not tomorrow, not the next day, but soon. They'll have time to forget, to think they got away with it, and then they'll learn." He cupped her face in both hands. "But you won't see it. You won't be involved. You'll go to work, come home, live your life, and one day you might hear that something unfortunate happened to some real estate developers from the north side. But it won't touch you. Vincent, go take a shower. Burn that uniform if you want to. I'll make you something to eat. It's 2 a.m. I don't care. You need to eat and I need to take care of you. Let me." Emma nodded, too exhausted to argue. As she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, she heard Vincent moving around in the kitchen below. She showered for a long time, washing away the beer and the shame and the memory of those laughing faces. When she came down in clean pajamas, her hair wrapped in a towel, she found Vincent had made her favorite, grilled cheese and tomato soup, simple comfort food that her mother used to make when she was young. They ate together in companionable silence at the kitchen island, the only sound the clink of spoons against bowls. "I love you," Emma said suddenly. Vincent looked up, surprised. "I love you too. Why do you say it like that?" "Because I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you do, I understand why. I might not like all of it. I might not want to know the details, but I understand." Something shifted in Vincent's expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper she couldn't quite name. "That's all I ever needed to hear." They finished eating and went to bed, Vincent holding her close as rain continued to hammer against the windows. Emma fell asleep feeling safe, protected, cherished. But somewhere out there in the Chicago night, 5 men were sleeping peacefully in their expensive homes, completely unaware that they had just marked themselves for a reckoning. The hunter had their scent now, and Vincent Graves never forgot a debt. 3 days passed with unsettling normalcy. Emma returned to her shifts at Rosewood Tavern, and life continued its ordinary rhythm. The beer-soaked uniform had been thrown away, the incident becoming just another unpleasant memory filed away with countless others from years of service work. Gerald had been extra considerate, checking on her frequently. Danny the bartender had slipped her an extra 20 from his tips with a sympathetic wink. Even Marcus had made her favorite dessert, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, on her break. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of waiting, of something inevitable approaching like a storm on the horizon. Vincent had been different these past few days. Not cold, never cold to her, but distant in a way that had nothing to do with affection. He would kiss her goodbye in the morning with genuine warmth, ask about her day with authentic interest, make love to her at night with the same tender intensity he always had. But there were phone calls he took in his study with the door closed, text messages that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, moments when she'd catch him staring at nothing, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely. She didn't ask. That was part of their unspoken agreement. She didn't ask about the business, and he didn't burden her with details she didn't need to carry. On the 4th day after the incident, Emma had just finished her lunch shift and was heading to her car when her phone buzzed. A text from Vincent. Dinner at Marcello's tonight. 7 p.m. Wear the blue dress. Marcello's was their special place, an upscale Italian restaurant in River North where Vincent had taken her on their first date. The blue dress was the one he'd bought her for their anniversary, silk and elegant, the kind of thing she never would have purchased for herself. The message was simple, but Emma understood what it meant. Tonight was about them, about reminding her that she was loved and valued, perhaps before something happened that might make her question things. She texted back a simple heart emoji and drove home. That afternoon, Emma took her time getting ready. She soaked in a hot bath, styled her hair in loose waves, applied makeup more carefully than usual. When she slipped into the blue dress and looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't Emma the hostess, the girl who got beer thrown at her. This was Emma Graves, wife of one of the most powerful men in Chicago, and tonight, she would look the part. Vincent arrived home at 6:30, and when he saw her, he stopped in the bedroom doorway with an expression of pure appreciation. "You're stunning," he said simply. He'd changed into a tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair combed back, a platinum watch gleaming at his wrist. Together, they looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about Chicago's elite. The drive to Marcello's took 20 minutes through early evening traffic. Vincent drove his black Mercedes S-Class with practiced ease, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching over to hold Emma's. They talked about small things, her shift, a funny customer, a new recipe she wanted to try, normal couple things. But Emma noticed how Vincent's eyes constantly scanned the mirrors, how his body remained alert despite the casual conversation. Marcello's occupied the ground floor of a historic building, all exposed brick and candlelight, with a reputation for the best osso buco in the city. The maitre d', a distinguished man named Antonio, greeted Vincent by name and led them to a private corner booth, the best table in the house. "Mr. Graves, Mrs. Graves, so wonderful to see you both," Antonio said warmly, presenting menus with a flourish. "Should I send over your usual wine?" "Please," Vincent confirmed. "And we'll start with the burrata." As Antonio glided away, Emma looked around the restaurant. It was moderately busy for a Sunday evening, well-dressed couples and business associates conducting quiet conversations over pasta and wine. Waiters moved like shadows between tables, efficient and nearly invisible. "This is nice," Emma said, reaching across the table to take Vincent's hand. "I needed this." "I know." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I'm sorry I've been distracted lately." "Business?" "Always business." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "There's something I need to tell you. Not about what happened. I meant what I said about keeping you separate from that, but about why I do what I do." Emma waited, sensing this was important. "My father," Vincent began, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "was a bus driver. South Side. Same routes for 30 years. My mother cleaned houses. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with my 3 sisters, and there were months when we ate rice and beans for every meal because that's all we could afford. I was 12 when my father got sick. Cancer. He had insurance through the transit authority, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough." He paused as their wine arrived. A bottle of Barolo, rich and dark as blood. Antonio poured 2 glasses and retreated. I watched my father die slowly because we couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved him. Vincent continued, his eyes distant with memory. I watched my mother work herself to exhaustion trying to keep us fed. I watched my sisters drop out of school one by one to help with bills. And you know what I learned, Emma? The world is divided into two kinds of people. Those who get stepped on, and those who do the stepping. So you decided to be the one doing the stepping? No. His eyes refocused on her, intense and unwavering. I decided to be the one who stops it. In my own way. The men who work for me, most of them come from the same neighborhoods I did. I pay them well, give them respect, make sure their families are taken care of. The businesses I protect pay fair wages, treat employees decently, or they find someone else to do business with. I'm not a good man by most measures, but I have rules. Lines I don't cross. Like what? No drugs, no prostitution, no hurting anyone who can't defend themselves. The money I make comes from gambling, from protection services, from construction contracts that maybe aren't entirely legal but don't hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it. I take from people who have more than they need and use it to protect people who have less than they should. Emma absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with what she knew of the world. A Robin Hood in an Armani suit? Vincent's laugh was unexpected and genuine. Something like that, I suppose. Though I keep more than Robin Hood did. I'm not a saint, Emma. I just have standards. Their burrata arrived, creamy and perfect, on a bed of heirloom tomatoes and basil. They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments before Emma spoke again. Those men at the bar, they violated one of your rules. They did. They hurt someone who couldn't defend herself. Someone under my protection, even if they didn't know it. He set down his fork, his expression hardening slightly. And that can't stand. Not because I'm angry, though I am, but because if I let it go, what message does that send? That my wife can be humiliated without consequence? That there are no rules? What are you going to do to them? Nothing permanent. Nothing that will destroy their lives completely. But they'll lose things they value. Money, certainly. Reputation, definitely. Maybe some dignity. They'll understand what it feels like to be powerless, just for a little while. And they'll never forget the lesson. Emma thought about this as their main courses arrived. Braised short ribs for her, the osso buco for Vincent. She thought about those men's laughter, their casual cruelty, the way they'd looked at her like she was nothing. And she thought about all the other people they'd probably treated the same way over the years, secure in the knowledge that their money and status protected them from consequences. I'm not saying I approve, she said finally, but I understand, and I won't pretend to be sorry for them. Vincent's expression softened. That's all I ask, for you to understand, even if you don't agree with everything. They finished dinner talking about lighter things, plans for Thanksgiving, whether they should finally take that trip to Italy they'd been discussing, Emma's idea of taking some night classes in business management. By the time they left Marcello's around 9:30, Emma felt lighter than she had in days, reconnected to the man she loved in a way that transcended the violence and darkness of his world. Vincent was helping her into the car when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and something shifted in his expression. I need to take this. 1 minute. He stepped a few feet away, phone to his ear, his posture changing subtly, shoulders back, voice dropping to that tone Emma recognized as business mode. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw him nod once, twice, then end the call. When he returned to the car, he was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. Change of plans. I need to drop you at home and take care of something. Tonight? It won't take long, few hours at most. Will you be okay? Emma wanted to ask what it was, wanted to know if this was about those men, but she'd learned when to push and when to let things be. I'll be fine, just be careful. Always am. The drive home was quieter than the drive to dinner. Vincent's mind was clearly elsewhere, already focused on whatever waited for him. When they pulled up to their brownstone, he walked her to the door, kissed her deeply, and held her close for a long moment. I love you, he said into her hair. Remember that. Whatever you might hear in the next few days. I love you too. Come home safe. Emma watched from the window as Vincent drove away, the Mercedes' taillights disappearing into the Chicago night. She changed into comfortable clothes, made herself chamomile tea, and tried to focus on the novel she'd been reading. But the words blurred together, meaningless on the page. Somewhere out there, Vincent was doing whatever Vincent did, and 5 men who thought they were untouchable were about to discover how wrong they were. Emma tried not to think about it, tried not to imagine what form Vincent's justice would take. But she couldn't help wondering if those men were at home right now, safe and warm with their families, completely unaware that their lives were about to change. The clock in the living room ticked steadily toward midnight. Emma dozed on the couch, her tea growing cold in its cup, waiting for the sound of Vincent's key in the lock. Outside, the November wind howled through the streets of Chicago, carrying with it the promise of winter and the weight of debts about to be paid. In a warehouse on the south side, Vincent Graves stood before a table covered with photographs, financial documents, and detailed notes about 5 men who had made a critical mistake. His team, 6 loyal men who'd been with him for years, waited silently for his instructions. Vincent studied the information one more time, his expression neutral, his mind calculating. Then he looked up at his men and spoke one word that would set everything in motion: tonight. The warehouse on the south side had been in Vincent's possession for nearly 8 years, purchased through a shell company and used for exactly these kinds of meetings. It was anonymous, surrounded by other industrial buildings, far from residential areas where curious neighbors might wonder about cars arriving late at night. Inside, the space was surprisingly well maintained. Concrete floors swept clean, overhead lights that actually worked, a few folding tables and chairs, and a small office in the back where Vincent kept files on every operation, every debt, every favor owed and collected. Tonight, 6 men stood around the largest table, their faces illuminated by a single overhead lamp that cast harsh shadows across their features. These were Vincent's most trusted associates, not the foot soldiers who collected gambling debts or managed the protection routes, but his inner circle, the ones who handled the delicate situations that required intelligence, discretion, and absolute loyalty. Tommy Reeves stood to Vincent's right, a wiry man in his early 40s with graying temples and the watchful eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years in military intelligence before Vincent had recruited him. Tommy handled information, gathering it, analyzing it, weaponizing it when necessary. Next to Tommy was Marcus Chen, no relation to the chef at Rosewood Tavern, a stocky second-generation Chinese-American who'd grown up in Chinatown and now managed Vincent's legitimate business interests. Marcus had an MBA from Northwestern and could make money disappear and reappear with the stroke of a pen. Across from them stood the Santos brothers, Rafael and Diego, 2 ex-cops who'd left the force after witnessing too much corruption and deciding that if the system was broken, they might as well work for someone with principles, however unconventional. They handled physical security and, when necessary, physical persuasion. Rounding out the group was James "Jimmy" O'Brien, an Irish kid from the West Side who looked like he should be serving drinks at a college bar, but was actually one of the most skilled hackers Vincent had ever encountered. Jimmy could break into any system, access any database, and leave no trace of his presence. And finally, there was William Cross, the oldest of the group at 53, a former attorney who'd been disbarred for ethics violations that essentially amounted to being too good at his job. William understood the law better than most judges and knew exactly how to operate in the spaces between legal and illegal. These 6 men had helped Vincent build his empire from nothing, and he trusted them with his life. More importantly tonight, he trusted them with his wife's honor. "Gentlemen," Vincent began, his voice calm and measured, "3 nights ago, my wife was publicly humiliated while working at Rosewood Tavern. 5 men, drunk on cheap beer and their own sense of superiority, decided it would be amusing to pour an entire pitcher over her head and laugh while she stood there, unable to defend herself without risking her job." He let that sink in for a moment. Every man in the room knew Emma, had met her at various gatherings, had seen how Vincent's entire demeanor softened in her presence. They also knew that Vincent's love for his wife was the one pure thing in his otherwise morally gray existence. An attack on Emma was an attack on Vincent himself. "Tommy," Vincent continued, "tell me what you've learned." Tommy stepped forward, pulling out a tablet and swiping through screens. "The 5 men are all real estate developers operating under the company name Lakeshore Property Group. They specialize in buying up old buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods, pushing out long-term residents and putting up overpriced condos." He pulled up photographs of each man, displaying them on the tablet for everyone to see. The leader, the one with the gold watch who actually threw the beer, is Richard Blackwood. 52 years old, divorced twice, 3 kids he barely sees, net worth approximately $40 million. Most of it tied up in properties. He's got a reputation in the industry for being ruthless. He's been sued 17 times by former tenants, settled out of court every time. Tommy swiped to the next photo. This is Stephen Marsh, 48, married with 2 kids. Quieter than Blackwood, but just as dirty. He handles the financial side of their operation, also worth about $30 million. His wife doesn't know that he keeps a mistress in a condo in the Gold Coast. The presentation continued through the remaining three. David Chen, no relation to Marcus, 45, single, tech investor turned developer. Robert Kane, 51, married, former city council member who left politics under suspicious circumstances. And Patrick Sullivan, 47, married with 4 children, the youngest of the group and seemingly the least offensive, though his participation in Emma's humiliation made him just as guilty as the others. They meet every other Thursday at Rosewood Tavern, Tommy concluded. It's their routine. Drinks, dinner, talk business, harass the staff. They've been doing it for about 2 years. Management tolerates them because they spend big money and tip well, usually. Not this time, apparently. Vincent nodded slowly, processing the information. Financial vulnerabilities? Marcus Chen stepped forward, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. All 5 of them are overextended. They've been riding the real estate boom, leveraging properties to buy more properties, assuming the market will keep climbing. Blackwood in particular has borrowed heavily against his portfolio. If even 3 or 4 of his major projects fell through simultaneously, he'd be looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. And the others? Similar situations, just not as severe. Marsh has tied up most of his liquid assets in a development in Pilsen that's behind schedule and over budget. Kane's got some gambling debts, not with us, with some independent operators who aren't as reasonable as we are. Sullivan's actually the most solvent of the group, but he's also got the most to lose reputationally. Family man, active in his church, sits on 2 charitable boards. A scandal would destroy him socially. Vincent smiled without humor. So they're all vulnerable in different ways. Good. That gives us options. Jimmy, what about digital footprints? The young hacker looked up from his laptop, where his fingers had been flying across the keyboard throughout the entire briefing. Oh man, these guys are a goldmine. None of them understand basic security. Blackwood uses the same password for everything. His dog's name plus the year he was born. I'm already in his email, his bank accounts, even his dating apps. Want to guess how many women he's messaged in the past month? I don't need to know his personal habits, Vincent said. I need to know what we can use. Right, sorry. Blackwood's got emails discussing some very questionable building code violations. Bribes to inspectors, falsified safety reports, that kind of thing. Marsh has been cooking the books on their corporate taxes. Not obvious stuff, but enough to trigger an IRS audit if someone pointed them in the right direction. Kane's got photographs on his phone that his wife definitely wouldn't approve of. Sullivan's the cleanest, but even he's got some problematic text messages about their tenant displacement strategies that could look very bad in court. Download everything, Vincent instructed. We may not use it all, but I want options. William Cross had been silent until now, but he cleared his throat. Vincent, if I may offer some perspective from a legal standpoint, what you're planning could have serious consequences if we're not careful. These men, while morally bankrupt, are well connected. They have lawyers, accountants, probably some city officials in their pockets. If they suspect they're being targeted, they could cause problems. I'm aware of the risks, William. That's why we're going to be surgical about this. Nothing violent, nothing that can be traced back to us, and nothing that will make them think they're being specifically targeted. To the outside world, what happens to them will look like a series of unfortunate coincidences and poor business decisions. Rafael Santos spoke up, his voice carrying the rough edges of his South Side upbringing. Boss, just say the word and Diego and I can have a conversation with these guys. The kind of conversation that doesn't leave marks but makes a lasting impression. No, Vincent said firmly. That's not how we're handling this. Physical intimidation is too direct, too obvious. These men hurt my wife without laying a finger on her. We're going to return the favor. We're going to hurt them without them ever seeing us coming. He turned back to the table, spreading out the photographs of the 5 developers. Here's what we're going to do. Marcus, I want you to identify their most vulnerable properties and start applying pressure. Nothing illegal, just strategic problems. Worker strikes, permit delays, material shortages. Make their projects start hemorrhaging money. Marcus nodded, already making notes. Tommy, I want full surveillance on all 5 of them. Where they go, who they meet, what they do. I want to know their routines, their habits, their weaknesses, but keep it discreet. If they notice they're being watched, the whole thing falls apart. Consider it done. Jimmy, start planting seeds in their digital lives. Nothing obvious at first, just small things that will cause confusion and frustration. emails that don't arrive, appointments that mysteriously get canceled, banking transactions that get delayed. Make their technological lives start falling apart in ways that seem random but accumulate. I can do that, Jimmy said with a grin. Death by 1,000 digital cuts. William, I want you to identify every legal vulnerability they have, every lawsuit waiting to happen, every regulation they're skirting, every gray area they're exploiting. We're not going to break any laws ourselves, but we're going to make sure they're held accountable for all the laws they've broken. I'll need a few days to compile everything, but I can give you a comprehensive report. Good. Rafael, Diego, I want you two to handle the personal touches. Nothing threatening, nothing that crosses the line. But these men need to start feeling uncomfortable in their own lives. Park outside their houses occasionally. Show up at their regular restaurants. Let them sense a presence without being able to define what it is. Make them paranoid. The Santos brothers exchanged glances, understanding perfectly what Vincent wanted. Psychological warfare, Diego said. We can do that. Vincent stood back, surveying his team. This isn't about revenge. This is about balance. These men thought they could humiliate someone without consequence because they've gone their whole lives without facing real consequences. We're going to teach them differently, but we're going to do it smart. Nothing we do can blow back on Emma. Nothing can be traced to this organization, and nothing can put any of you at legal risk. Are we clear? 6 heads nodded in unison. Then let's get to work. I want preliminary reports in 48 hours. We move carefully, methodically. This isn't a sprint, it's a chess game. And gentlemen, Vincent paused, his expression hardening. We don't lose at chess. The meeting broke up, each man heading off to begin his assigned tasks. Vincent remained at the table for a few minutes after they'd all left, staring at the photographs of the 5 developers. In his mind, he could still see Emma's face on the phone, hear the tremor in her voice. Imagine her standing there soaked in beer while these men laughed. He pulled out his phone and sent Emma a text. On my way home soon. Love you. Her reply came back almost immediately. Love you too. Drive safe. Vincent smiled slightly. Emma didn't need to know the details of what was being set in motion. She didn't need to carry that weight. All she needed to know was that she was loved, protected, and that in Vincent's world, debts were always paid. He turned off the lights in the warehouse and headed to his car. The November night was cold and clear, stars visible despite the city's light pollution. Somewhere out there, Richard Blackwood and his associates were probably sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that their lives had just been marked for systematic dismantling. Vincent didn't feel anger anymore. Anger was hot, impulsive, liable to make you sloppy. What he felt now was something colder and far more dangerous. Purpose. As he drove home through the empty streets, he thought about his father dying slowly in that hospital bed, unable to afford the treatments that might have saved him. He thought about his mother's worn hands, his sister's abandoned dreams. He thought about all the people he'd known growing up who'd been stepped on, ground down, dismissed as insignificant by those who had the power to do so. And he thought about Emma, his Emma, who worked hard and asked for nothing and deserved to be treated with dignity. The men who'd hurt her would learn a lesson that most people never had to learn the hard way. In Vincent Graves's Chicago, everyone answered to someone. And tonight, the bill had come due. 2 weeks passed, and to anyone watching from the outside, life continued normally. Emma went to work at Rosewood Tavern, served customers with professional courtesy, and came home to Vincent each night. They cooked dinner together, watched old movies on the couch, made love with the comfortable familiarity of 2 people who truly knew each other. On the surface, everything was peaceful, but underneath, Vincent's machine was working with devastating precision. It started small, so small that Richard Blackwood didn't even notice at first. A permit application that should have been approved in 3 days took 2 weeks instead, with the city clerk apologizing profusely about system errors. A shipment of custom windows for his luxury condo project in Wicker Park was delayed at the warehouse, the supplier citing mysterious inventory discrepancies. A key investor in one of his developments suddenly got cold feet and pulled out, spooked by an anonymous tip about foundation problems that turned out to be nothing but cost Blackwood 2 weeks of damage control. Individually, these were just the normal frustrations of doing business in Chicago, but they kept happening. Every project Blackwood touched seemed to hit unexpected obstacles. His contractors reported that workers were demanding higher wages or threatening to strike. His architect quit abruptly, citing creative differences. The bank that typically rubber-stamped his loan applications suddenly wanted additional documentation for everything. Stephen Marsh's problems were different but equally frustrating. His carefully balanced book started showing discrepancies. Nothing major, just small errors that took hours to track down and fix. Clients would claim they never received his emails. Or worse, received emails he'd never sent asking strange questions or making unusual requests. His mistress, the one his wife knew nothing about, started getting suspicious when flowers he swore he'd ordered never arrived, when reservations he'd made were mysteriously canceled. The IRS sent him a letter, just a routine inquiry, they said, about some deductions from 3 years ago. Marsh knew his tax strategies were aggressive but legal. Still, an audit was an audit, and it meant thousands of dollars in accounting fees and dozens of hours of his time to prove he'd done nothing wrong. David Chen found his reputation taking inexplicable hits. Reviews of his properties started appearing online, not obviously fake ones that could be easily dismissed, but detailed, articulate complaints from what appeared to be real tenants. His response rate on rental platforms dropped mysteriously, making him look unresponsive to potential clients. A journalist from the Chicago Tribune started asking questions about his business practices, saying they'd received a tip about housing code violations. Robert Kane's gambling debts, which he'd been managing to keep quiet, suddenly became public knowledge. Not widely public, just to the right people. His wife found a collection notice that he'd managed to intercept before. His country club received an anonymous complaint about his behavior. The charitable board he sat on started asking uncomfortable questions about a loan he'd taken from their operating budget 3 years ago. A loan he'd fully repaid but hadn't properly documented. And Patrick Sullivan, the family man, the church elder, the one who seemed the least culpable, watched in horror as screenshots of text messages he'd sent to his business partners appeared on a burner phone left in his wife's car. Messages where he joked about clearing out the dead weight, meaning elderly tenants in rent-controlled apartments. Messages where he discussed strategies to make life so unpleasant for long-time residents that they'd move voluntarily. Nothing illegal, but everything ugly, and everything completely contrary to the image he'd cultivated of himself as a pillar of the community. His wife, Sarah, a devout Catholic who'd believed her husband to be a good Christian businessman, confronted him with tears streaming down her face. "Who are you?" she'd asked. "The man I married wouldn't talk about people like this." Sullivan had no good answer. Through it all, the 5 men never connected the dots. How could they? The problem seemed random, unrelated. Chicago was a difficult city to do business in. Everyone knew that. Sometimes you hit a rough patch. Sometimes things went wrong for no apparent reason. But the rough patch kept getting rougher. Emma knew something was happening even if Vincent never discussed it directly. She could see it in the way he'd smile slightly when checking his phone, in the quiet satisfaction that occasionally crossed his face during dinner. She'd catch fragments of phone conversations, nothing specific, just tones and cadences that suggested wheels in motion. She didn't ask. That was their agreement. But she did notice when, 3 weeks after the incident, the developers stopped coming to Rosewood Tavern for their regular Thursday night meetings. Gerald mentioned it during one of her shifts, seeming puzzled. "Weird," he said, checking the reservation book. "Blackwood's group always books for Thursday nights, haven't seen them in weeks. Hope they didn't switch to another restaurant." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. Maybe they just got busy. Maybe. Though we could use their business. They always spent big. That night, Emma came home to find Vincent in his study, classical music playing softly from the speakers. Vivaldi, she recognized, his favorite for when he was working. She knocked gently on the open door. "Hey," she said. "You busy?" Vincent looked up from his laptop, his face softening immediately. "Never too busy for you. Come here." She crossed the room and perched on the arm of his leather chair. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "How was work?" "Fine. Slow for a Thursday." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Gerald mentioned that those developers haven't been coming around lately, the ones who used to have the regular reservation." Vincent's expression didn't change, but Emma felt the subtle shift in his posture. "Is that right?" "Vincent, what did you do?" "I kept my promise," he said simply. "They learned that actions have consequences, but you don't need to know more than that." Are they okay? I mean, you didn't..." "They're fine. Frustrated, stressed, losing money and sleep, but physically fine. No one laid a hand on them. No one threatened them. They're just experiencing what it's like when the universe stops cooperating with your plans." He turned to look at her directly. "Does that bother you?" Emma thought about it honestly. She thought about those men's laughter, their casual cruelty, the way they'd looked at her like she was nothing. She thought about all the people they'd probably hurt over the years, tenants displaced, employees mistreated, anyone they considered beneath them. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't bother me. Is that wrong? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that question." Vincent pulled her down into his lap and she curled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You're a good person, Emma. Better than me. But even good people can accept that sometimes bad people need to be reminded that they're not invincible." They sat like that for a while, wrapped in each other in the soft strains of Vivaldi, while outside the November night deepened into something darker and colder. What Emma didn't know, what Vincent had carefully shielded her from, was just how thoroughly his team had infiltrated every aspect of the developers' lives. Tommy Reeves had surveillance on all 5 men, tracking their movements, their phone calls, their emails. He knew that Blackwood was drinking more, that his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. He knew that Marsh had started seeing a therapist for anxiety. He knew that David Chen had fired 3 assistants in 2 weeks, convinced they were incompetent when really it was Jimmy's digital interference making them look bad. Marcus Chen had systematically targeted every vulnerable point in their business empire. Permits delayed. Contractors suddenly unavailable. Materials priced higher than expected. Investors spooked by carefully planted rumors. Nothing illegal, nothing actionable, but death by 1,000 cuts. Each one small enough to seem like bad luck, but collectively devastating. Jimmy O'Brien was having the time of his life, treating the developers' digital lives like his personal playground. Emails routed to spam folders, online banking sessions timing out at crucial moments, smart home systems malfunctioning, lights turning on and off randomly, thermostats adjusting themselves, security cameras going offline just long enough to make the owners paranoid. William Cross had filed complaints with every relevant regulatory agency, all completely legitimate, all based on actual violations the developers had committed, but previously gotten away with. Building inspectors who'd been paid to look the other way suddenly found themselves under investigation and decided to start doing their jobs properly. City council members who'd taken bribes got nervous and stopped returning calls, and Rafael and Diego Santos had perfected the art of the invisible threat. They never approached the developers directly, never said a word, but they were always there, sitting in a car outside Blackwood's house at 2 a.m, standing in the corner of Marsh's regular coffee shop, just watching, walking past Kane on the street and making eye contact for just a second too long, appearing in Sullivan's rearview mirror on his commute home, following for exactly 3 blocks before turning off. The developers couldn't report it because there was nothing to report. No laws were being broken, no threats were being made, but the psychological impact was profound. These were men who'd spent their lives feeling safe, secure, untouchable. Now they felt watched, vulnerable, paranoid. Blackwood started having trouble sleeping. He'd lie awake at night, his mind racing through everything going wrong, trying to find a pattern, a reason, someone to blame. His doctor prescribed sleeping pills, then anti-anxiety medication. Nothing helped. Marsh's marriage began to fracture under the pressure. His wife could tell something was wrong, but he couldn't explain what. How do you tell your spouse that your entire world seems to be falling apart for no reason you can identify? She started suspecting an affair, ironically not the one he was actually having, but a different imaginary one that explained his stress and distraction. David Chen's reputation in the real estate community took serious hits. Word got around that his projects were cursed, that investors who worked with him lost money, that tenants in his buildings complained more than average. None of it was true, or rather all of it was true now because Vincent had made it true, but perception was reality in business. Kane's wife filed for separation, taking their 2 children to her sister's house in Milwaukee. The gambling debts he'd hidden for years were now impossible to ignore, and while she might have forgiven the debts themselves, she couldn't forgive the years of lies. The charitable board asked for his resignation. His friends at the country club started avoiding him. Sullivan had it worst of all, perhaps because he'd had the furthest to fall. His church community, which had been his social foundation for 20 years, looked at him differently now. The pastor had seen those text messages. Sarah had shown them to him, seeking guidance. And while he preached forgiveness, there was disappointment in his eyes that cut deeper than any anger could have. Sullivan's children, teenagers old enough to understand, had lost respect for their father. His oldest daughter stopped speaking to him entirely. 4 weeks after the incident at Rosewood Tavern, Richard Blackwood sat in his downtown office at 11 o'clock at night, staring at a spreadsheet that showed him teetering on the edge of financial ruin. 6 of his major projects were behind schedule and over budget. 3 investors had pulled out. 2 buildings he'd been counting on purchasing had gone to other buyers at the last minute. His credit lines were maxed out. His cash reserves were nearly depleted. He couldn't understand how it had all gone so wrong so quickly. His phone rang. His business line, which nobody should be calling at this hour. He stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood. The voice was male, calm, unaccented. I hope I'm not calling too late. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your recent difficulties with great interest. I wanted to offer some advice. Blackwood's hand tightened on the phone. If you're a reporter, I'm not. I'm just someone who believes in balance, in karma, you might say. Do you remember, Mr. Blackwood, about a month ago you and your associates went to a bar called Rosewood Tavern? The blood drained from Blackwood's face. What? You had some drinks, you had some laughs. Ooh. You humiliated a young woman who was just trying to do her job. You thought it was funny. You thought there would be no consequences. I don't know what Her name is Emma, the voice continued, still perfectly calm. And she didn't deserve what you did to her, nobody does, but especially not her. Blackwood's mind was racing. Are you saying all of this, everything that's been happening? I'm saying that in this world, Mr. Blackwood, there are people you don't disrespect. There are lines you don't cross. You crossed one. This is what happens when you do. This is extortion. This is illegal. I'll call the police. And tell them what? That your business is failing? That permits are being delayed? That investors are nervous? What law has been broken, Mr. Blackwood? What crime can you report? Silence on the line. Blackwood's breathing was ragged. Here's what's going to happen, the voice said. You're going to learn to treat people with respect. All people, not just the ones with money and power. You're going to remember this conversation every time you're tempted to abuse someone who can't fight back. And if you ever forget, if you or any of your associates ever step out of line again, this will happen again, Blackwood whispered. This will seem like a warning by comparison. Do we understand each other? Blackwood closed his eyes. Yes. Good. Oh, and Mr. Blackwood, that young woman at Rosewood Tavern, her name is Emma. I want you to remember that name. Emma. Say it. Emma, Blackwood said quietly. Remember it. Remember that she's a person with dignity who deserves respect. Remember that you don't get to treat people like garbage just because you have money. Remember that someone is always watching and some debts always come due. The line went dead. Blackwood sat in his office for a long time after that, the phone still in his hand, his entire body trembling. Around him, his empire was crumbling, and he finally understood why. He'd laughed at the wrong person. He'd poured beer on someone who mattered to someone powerful, and now he was paying the price. 6 months had passed since that November night at Rosewood Tavern, and Chicago had transformed from the brutal grip of winter into the tentative promise of spring. The trees along Lincoln Park were budding with new leaves. The air had lost its knife-edge cold, and people walked the streets without hunching their shoulders against the wind. It was the kind of April morning that made you forget how dark and frozen the world had been just weeks before. Emma stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. She'd quit her job at Rosewood Tavern 2 months ago, not because of what had happened, but because she'd finally enrolled in those business management classes she'd been talking about. Vincent had encouraged her, even insisted on paying for everything despite her protests that she could use her savings. Your money is your money, he'd said firmly. Let me invest in your future. It makes me happy. She was thriving in her classes, discovering that she had a natural aptitude for business strategy and organizational management. Her professors praised her insights. Her classmates, who had no idea she was married to one of the most powerful men in Chicago, treated her as an equal. For the first time in years, Emma felt like she was building something that belonged entirely to her. But this morning wasn't about classes. This morning was about something else entirely. Something she'd been keeping secret for the past week, waiting for the right moment to tell Vincent. She heard him moving around in the bedroom, getting dressed for the day. Taking a deep breath, Emma picked up the small white stick from the counter, the one with 2 pink lines clearly visible, and walked out to meet her husband. Vincent was buttoning a navy shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. When he looked up and saw her expression, he froze immediately, reading her face the way he always could. Emma, what's wrong? She didn't say anything, just held up the pregnancy test. For a moment, Vincent Graves, the man who controlled half of Chicago's underground economy, who could make grown men tremble with a glance, who never showed weakness or uncertainty, stood completely still, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and then pure, unguarded joy. He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "We're having a baby," Emma said, and suddenly she was crying and laughing at the same time. "I'm pregnant, Vincent. About 8 weeks, the doctor thinks." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so carefully as if she might break. She felt his body shaking slightly and realized with astonishment that he was crying too, silent tears that he buried in her hair. "I never thought," he started, then stopped. "I never let myself hope for this. I didn't think I deserved it." Emma pulled back to look at him, cupping his face in her hands. "You deserve happiness, Vincent. You deserve a family. You deserve all the good things." They stood there in their bedroom, wrapped in each other in the morning light, while outside the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to the small miracle happening in one brownstone in Lincoln Park. Later that day, after Vincent had left for a meeting and Emma had gone to her afternoon class, she found herself thinking about those 5 men, the developers who'd humiliated her that night. She wondered sometimes what had happened to them, though Vincent had never offered details and she'd never asked. What Emma didn't know was that the aftermath of Vincent's carefully orchestrated campaign had been both devastating and, in some ways, redemptive. Richard Blackwood had lost everything. His company, Lakeshore Property Group, had filed for bankruptcy 3 months ago. Most of his properties had been sold at auction to cover debts. His reputation in the Chicago real estate community was destroyed, not just because of his financial failures, but because word had gotten out about his treatment of tenants, his shady business practices, his general cruelty. The Tribune had run an expose that Jimmy had carefully fed to an investigative journalist, complete with documented evidence of building code violations and tenant harassment. But something unexpected had happened in the ruins of Blackwood's empire. Stripped of his money and power, forced to move into a modest apartment in a neighborhood he once would have scorned, Blackwood had been given something he'd never had before: perspective. He'd gotten a job as a property manager for a small apartment building, the only work he could find, and for the first time in his life, he was on the other side of the landlord-tenant relationship. He saw how the tenant struggled, how a rent increase could mean choosing between food and medicine, how a broken heater wasn't just an inconvenience but a genuine crisis. One of his tenants was a single mother named Maria who reminded him, painfully, of that hostess at Rosewood Tavern. The same age, the same determination to maintain dignity, despite difficult circumstances. When her rent was late one month, Blackwood had surprised himself by giving her an extension without penalties, by actually listening to her situation, by treating her like a human being rather than an obstacle. It wasn't redemption exactly. Blackwood knew he could never undo the harm he'd caused over decades of ruthless business practices, but it was change, and sometimes change was the best you could hope for. Stephen Marsh's marriage had survived, barely, but only after he'd confessed everything: the creative accounting, the mistress, the years of deception. His wife Linda had insisted on marriage counseling as a condition of staying together. The therapist had helped them understand that Marsh's behavior was rooted in deep insecurity, a desperate need to prove his worth through money and conquest. He was working on it, genuinely trying to become the man his wife deserved rather than the man he'd been. The IRS audit had resulted in significant fines but no criminal charges. Marsh had paid what he owed, restructured his business practices to be legitimately legal rather than creatively questionable, and found that he actually slept better at night. His income was lower now, but his stress was lower too. Sometimes he thought about that night at Rosewood Tavern, about the young woman they'd humiliated, and felt a shame so profound it was almost physical. David Chen had left Chicago entirely, moving to Seattle to start over. The damage to his reputation had been too extensive to recover from in a city where everyone in the industry knew everyone else. In Seattle, he was nobody, which was both humbling and liberating. He'd started small, managing a single apartment building, determined to do things differently this time. He'd implemented tenant councils, fair rent policies, responsive maintenance. He'd discovered that treating people well wasn't just morally right. It was actually good business. His tenants stayed longer, took better care of the property, referred their friends. He'd never be rich like he'd been before, but he was building something he could actually be proud of. Robert Kane's life had fallen apart spectacularly. The gambling debts, the public scandals, the loss of his family. It had all spiraled into a dark place that culminated in him checking into a rehabilitation facility for gambling addiction. He'd been there for 90 days, working through not just the addiction but the underlying issues that had driven it. His wife hadn't taken him back. That bridge was burned, but she had agreed to co-parent civilly for the sake of their children. Kane had gotten a job as an accountant for a nonprofit, work that would never make him wealthy but gave him a sense of purpose he'd never had when he was pursuing money for its own sake. And Patrick Sullivan, the family man, the church elder, had perhaps changed the most profoundly. The revelation of his true character had shattered his self-image so completely that he'd had no choice but to rebuild from the ground up. He'd resigned from all his business ventures, selling his shares to his partners at a loss. He'd spent 6 months doing nothing but attending church, reading scripture, volunteering at a homeless shelter, and trying to understand how he'd become someone who could joke about displacing elderly tenants. His wife Sarah had eventually forgiven him, though trust was being rebuilt slowly, carefully. His children were coming around, impressed despite themselves by their father's genuine efforts to change. Sullivan had started a new business, a non-profit that helped low-income families navigate the housing market and fight against predatory landlords. He used all his knowledge of real estate, all his understanding of the system's loopholes and cruelties, to help people protect themselves from men like he used to be. Sometimes, late at night, he would think about that hostess at Rosewood Tavern. He didn't know her name, none of them had bothered to ask, but he carried her in his memory like a ghost. In his darkest moments, when he questioned whether he was really changing or just performing change, he would remember her face as the beer poured over her head, and he would feel that shame like a physical weight. It kept him honest. It kept him working. Vincent knew all of this, of course. Tommy Reeves kept tabs on all 5 men, updating Vincent monthly on their locations, their activities, their progress, or lack thereof. Vincent read these reports with interest but no particular satisfaction. He'd never wanted to destroy these men, just to teach them a lesson. The fact that some of them seemed to have learned it was more than he'd expected. But Emma knew none of these details. Vincent had kept his promise. She remained separate from that world, protected from the consequences of his actions. As far as she knew, those men had simply stopped coming to Rosewood Tavern, and that was the end of it. That evening, Vincent came home earlier than usual, carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and a bouquet of peonies, Emma's favorite flowers. They celebrated the pregnancy over a quiet dinner at home, talking about nursery colors and baby names and all the small miracles of creating new life. "I want to be a good father," Vincent said as they sat on the couch afterward, his hand resting gently on Emma's still flat stomach. "I want our child to grow up knowing they're loved, protected, valued. I want them to treat people with kindness and respect." "They will," Emma said softly, "because they'll learn from watching you. I'm not a good role model, Emma. You know what I am, what I do. I know that you protect the people you love. I know that you have principles, even if they're not conventional ones. I know that you believe in consequences for cruelty, in standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Those are good values, Vincent. Our child could do a lot worse." Vincent pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over Chicago. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, traffic and sirens and the constant motion of millions of lives intersecting and diverging. But inside their brownstone there was peace. What neither of them could know was that across the city, in 5 different locations, 5 men were also sitting in quiet contemplation of their lives and choices. Richard Blackwood, in his modest apartment, was helping his tenant Maria fix a leaky faucet, remembering a time when he would have ignored such a request for days or weeks. Stephen Marsh was at dinner with his wife, really listening to her talk about her day, really being present instead of mentally calculating profit margins. David Chen, in Seattle, was meeting with his tenant council, taking notes on their concerns, committed to actually addressing them. Robert Kane was in his small studio apartment, writing letters of apology to the people he'd hurt, letters he might never send but needed to write anyway. And Patrick Sullivan was at the homeless shelter, serving food to people who reminded him uncomfortably of the tenants he'd once dismissed as dead weight, seeing them now as human beings with stories and struggles and dignity. The ripple effects of that one November night had spread farther than Vincent had intended, touching more lives than he'd planned, creating changes he'd never anticipated. He'd wanted to teach a lesson about consequences. He hadn't expected that some of his targets might actually learn it. Emma fell asleep on the couch that night, her head on Vincent's shoulder, his hand still resting protectively over where their child was growing. Vincent stayed awake longer, thinking about fatherhood, about legacy, about the kind of world he wanted to create for his son or daughter. He thought about his own father, dying slowly in that hospital bed, unable to afford the treatment that might have saved him. He thought about his mother's worn hands, his sister's sacrificed dreams. He thought about all the Richard Blackwoods of the world, stepping on people because they could, because no one stopped them. And he thought about Emma, his Emma, who'd walked into his life 2 years ago and made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than his worst actions, that maybe redemption wasn't impossible, even for someone like him. In the darkness of their living room, with his pregnant wife sleeping peacefully against his chest, Vincent Graves made a silent promise. His child would grow up knowing that actions had consequences, that cruelty was never acceptable, that power was a responsibility rather than a right. His child would learn to protect the vulnerable, to stand up for the stepped on, to fight injustice wherever it appeared. But his child would also learn mercy, would understand that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define you forever, that sometimes the greatest strength was in forgiveness rather than revenge. Vincent had built an empire on fear and consequences. Maybe he thought it was time to start building something else, something better, a legacy that his child could actually be proud of. Outside, Chicago slept fitfully as it always did, the city of broad shoulders carrying its burdens into another uncertain dawn. But inside one brownstone in Lincoln Park, a small family was beginning, a family built on love and protection and the complicated ethics of a man trying to be better than his circumstances had made him. Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, and Vincent held her closer, feeling the weight of responsibility settling over him like a cloak. He'd protected her once by teaching 5 cruel men about consequences. Now he would protect her, protect both of them, by being the kind of father, the kind of man, who made the world a little less cruel, a little more just. It wasn't redemption. Vincent Graves was too realistic to believe in complete redemption for someone with his history, but it was change, and sometimes change was the best you could hope for. The city lights flickered through their windows like distant stars, and in the quiet hours before dawn, Vincent finally allowed himself to sleep, dreaming of a future where his child would never know what it meant to be powerless, would never have to learn the lessons Emma had learned that November night. Some debts had been paid, some lessons had been taught, and now finally it was time to build something new from the ashes of old wrongs. The story that had begun with beer and humiliation and casual cruelty had ended with unexpected grace, with 5 men learning to be better, with a marriage growing stronger, with a child on the way who would be born into a world that was, in its own small way, slightly more just than it had been before. Emma had called Vincent seeking protection. What she'd gotten was something much more profound, proof that someone valued her enough to move the world in her defense. And what Vincent had gotten, in teaching those 5 men their lesson, was something he'd never expected, a glimpse of the kind of father he could become, the kind of legacy he could leave. As dawn broke over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the Graves family slept peacefully, wrapped in the knowledge that they were loved, protected, and valued above all else. And somewhere in the city, 5 men who'd learned the hard way about consequences were waking up to try once again to be better than they'd been before. The story was over, but the lessons would last forever.